In this video, we'll show you how to paint the Carro Armato medium Italian tank, focusing on the details of the model. To start out, we'll be using matte black on the tracks of the tank here. And we will want to add about 1 to 2 thin coats of this paint here to the tracks. We will be going over them with other paints and details later on, but we want a nice solid foundation to start off with. And just try to avoid all of the panels of the tank with this color. You'll want to keep those the green and tan color that we have from the base coat. Next up, we'll be using oak brown to paint the exhaust pipes on the tank. Just use 2 thin coats of this as well, and we'll be going over this with another color, so it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. And just be sure you have some angel green and some desert yellow to clean up any mistakes you might make. If you accidentally get any paint on the armor panels, you want to be able to either wipe that away really quickly with another damp brush, or cover it up with those colors if you need to. And there's one of these on each side of the tank, so make sure you paint both of them before moving on to the next step. And as always, be sure to move the model around as needed to get those harder to reach areas like this right here underneath the armor panel there. Another detail we can pick out with the oak brown is the handles of the shovels and the tools here on the back of the tank. And while those exhausts are drying, we'll go ahead and take some matte white and just cover the lights on the tank really quickly as well. We will come back and add another few colors to this area, but for now we're just going to keep it as it is and focus on those exhausts and just kind of use this time to take a break and move on to something real quick. Now back to the exhausts on the back here, we're going to switch over to Dry Rust, and this is one of Army Painter's effect paints. We're going to use this to just kind of splotch some paint on each of the exhausts. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just going to add a little bit more detail, make them look really rusted and really worn out. And don't worry too much if this dries a little bit too light. We will be going back through over the entire tank with a wash, so just keep that in mind. We will be covering that up in a later stage. And as you can see here, I'm just kind of splotching in the dry rust wherever needed, and I will go back in later on with the wash to kind of blend everything together. You'll still want some of that oak brown showing through from the previous stage. And of course, just repeat this step on the other side before we move on to the next step. Okay, and now we'll finish off the headlights for the tank here, and we're going to move on to the speed paints for just a moment. This is Ancient Honey, this is one of their kind of darker orangish yellows. We're just going to simply coat the entirety of the white areas that we painted before with this color. And of course, when you're working with any speed paints or washes, always take your brush and wipe away any excess before it dries. And as you can see, we also painted the wheels black on the tank here. There's a couple other details that you'll need to refer to either pictures from history or the instruction manual to really see how the tank looks before you go paint it. And now we'll move on to all of our metallic details on the tank here, starting off with gunmetal. And we're going to use this to cover all of the guns and some other certain areas later on. There's actually quite a bit that you can do with a metallic paint to really add some detail to your tanks and really make them pop. So I will show you guys a couple of those techniques here in this video. Starting out though, we're just going to cover the guns, get our base coat coverage done, and then we'll move on to the more fun details. And once you get the guns done, we'll go ahead and move over to the shovel and any other small metallic details that we need to cover before moving on. Moving over to our first wash stage here, we're going to use strong tone over the entirety of the tank. Starting out with the tracks here, we're going to want to hit underneath the tank and every other panel as well. Going to be very liberal with the strong tone here, get it really dirty across the entire tank, and this will give us some nice detail and add some depth to the tank as well. And be sure to visit us over at wargamesdelivered.com if you'd like to pick up any of the paints, miniatures, or supplies used in this video. We always have promotions going on over at the site, so be sure to check in and take advantage of those when they come up. And while you're doing this step, just try to work fast. You'll want even, consistent coverage with the wash all the way across the tank. So just try to keep that in mind and work quickly across the entire tank. Alright, and for this next step, we're going to move back to the Speed Paint 2.0s, switching over to Ruddy Fur for a moment here. What we're going to do with this is simply dot all of the rivets on the tank, and this will create a simple, quick rusted effect, and also add some much needed detail to the tank after the wash. This is also a fantastic paint to add some simple rust effects with. If you want to add some rust lines across the armor panels of the tank, this is what I would use to do that. Just try to be very precise in this stage. You don't want to ruin the camouflage that we created earlier with the airbrush. And both of the speed paints that we used in this video, the Ancient Honey and the Ruddy Fur, are both included in the Speed Paint 2.0 Mega Set, which we have available on our site over at wargamesdelivered.com. Be sure to pick up this set if you haven't. It's a great tool to have for any level of painter. Okay, now we can move on to some of the more fun details that I like to do. We're using some tan texture paint here, just dipping it in Army Painter's Steppe Grass, I believe it's called. And just go ahead and shove this all over the tracks. Try to blend the grass into the texture as much as you can, and then just work it all throughout the tracks and try to avoid getting any on the flat armor panels of the tank. And of course, be sure to do this on both of the tracks and also on the insides of the tracks as well. That's something that I commonly forget about and have to go back and redo. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about being too messy on the bottom of the tank. We will be kind of coating that in the texture paint a little bit later on. So go ahead and be a little bit messy on the bottom side and just try to avoid making a mess on the top side there. Once you've got that done, we'll go ahead and go back to our strong tone, the quick shade, and we'll add a little bit of definition to the dried texture paint here. And again, repeat that on both sides. Basically, just any area that you hit with the texture paint, we'll want to cover that up with the strong tone. And while you're doing this step, just try to keep in mind which theater that you're going for with your army. For instance, this army that I'm building, this Italian Bersaglieri army, is going to be used mainly for the North African theater. So I'm painting them with a little bit more of a desert theme rather than their temperate uniform. If you're ever unsure how to paint something, historicals are very easy because you can go back and look on Google. And there's also some great pictures that Bolt Action provides in their instruction manuals and their PDFs as well. And if you'd like to save yourself some time, you can actually do the texture paint and grass step before you even do the initial strong tone wash step, and then you can do it all in one fell swoop. I like to space it out just so I have a little bit more control over the paint, but that's just how I work. Now the only thing left to do is finish up the commander in the top hatch, so we'll go ahead and start out with Barbarian Flesh for all of the skin on his face here. And with this step, we're looking just to base coat all of the skin of the model, mainly his face, but his hands are sticking out on the top of the hatch there, so we'll go ahead and cover those as well. And depending on how you like to work on your models, it might be easier to leave this guy out of the tank at first to paint him. I prefer to glue everything together first, at least loosely, so I can kind of see what the model looks like before I jump into painting. And off camera, I also went in with some Basilisk Brown and covered the jacket that he's wearing. Now we're going to move on to Skeleton Bone for his hat. Skeleton Bone is a bit of a lighter color, so you may need 2 to 3 thin coats of this to get a nice even finish on it. And these are the 3 big details on the model here, on the commander himself, but we will also switch over to some other colors for some finer details before we finish off the model completely. Now the commander does have a little bit of hair poking out underneath his hat, as well as a mustache, so we'll go ahead and switch over to oak brown to fill those in. You may want to switch to a smaller brush for this stage, just because it is a pretty tight spot there between the hat and the skin. You don't want to go over any of those details that we painted before. And once that's dry, we'll move on to doing some washes on the commander here, doing strong tone on his clothing, and we'll use flesh tone on his skin. And with that done, we'll give him some time to dry, and we'll detach the cork here and move on to the bottom stage here of the tank. And we simply just took the same technique with the texture paint and the grass and applied it to the bottom of the tank here. This is the Battlefield Steep grass that I used on the bottom. Once that texture paint is dry, go ahead and apply a quick layer of strong tone again, and our tank is ready for battle. We have one more video in this series coming up later on in this week, and I will show you guys how to apply transfers onto your painted models.